My name is Diana. I am 30 years old, and as I lay in a sterile hospital bed recovering from an emergency appendectomy, the last thing I expected was to be handed my own financial execution. My husband of 4 years thought I was just a lowly Army logistics officer, making a meager $3,000 a month. He genuinely believed my monthly drill weekends and military uniform meant I was completely dependent on his corporate salary. He had absolutely no idea that behind my modest military reserve status, I was actually the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Defense Tech, a private consulting firm that earned me over $940,000 a year. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit silently while an arrogant partner completely underestimated your worth. The fluorescent lights of the recovery ward buzzed above me, casting a sickly pale glow across the pristine white sheets. My abdomen throbbed with the dull, persistent ache of freshly stitched tissue. I had been in the hospital for 2 excruciating days, and up until this very moment, my husband had not answered a single phone call or text message. When the heavy wooden door to my room finally swung open, I expected to see a man riddled with guilt for missing my emergency surgery. Instead, Richard strode into the room looking like he had just won the lottery. There were no flowers in his hands, there was no greeting, no apology, and not a single ounce of empathy in his rigid posture. Richard was 32 years old, a mid-level manager at a boutique finance firm, and he wore his arrogance like a tailored suit. He marched directly to the side of my bed and dropped a thick manila folder right onto my lap. The heavy thud sent a sharp jolt of pain through my healing incision, but I refused to wince. "Sign them," he commanded, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. I filed for a fast-track divorce. My lawyer expedited the paperwork, and a judge just needs your signature to push it through by the end of the week. I stared at the folder, then looked up at his smug, unyielding face. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply asked him why he was doing this while I was bleeding in a hospital bed. Richard scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest, as if I were a burden he was finally putting down. "Because I am done carrying dead weight, Diana," he stated coldly. "I am keeping the Tudor-style home in the suburbs, and I am keeping the luxury SUV. You can take your little $3,000 a month Army paycheck and figure out your own life. You will never recover financially from this, but that is no longer my problem. I am tired of subsidizing your life while you play soldier in the mud." His words were designed to break me. He honestly believed he was the sole provider, the financial pillar holding up our entire existence. He believed his $90,000 salary was the only thing keeping a roof over our heads. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his monologue, the hospital room door creaked open again. A young woman stepped inside, her high heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. It was Brittany. She was 26 years old and dripping in designer clothes. I immediately recognized the handbag she was carrying because it had been purchased using the joint credit card Richard thought I never checked. Brittany walked straight over to Richard and wrapped her arm possessively around his waist, resting her head against his shoulder. She looked down at me in my faded hospital gown with a mixture of pity and absolute triumph. "Diana, right?" Brittany said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Richard told me you might be difficult about this, but you have to understand that he needs a real woman by his side." Richard kissed the top of her head, his eyes locked on mine to ensure I was watching this performance. "Look at her, Diana," he sneered, gesturing to Brittany's pristine outfit. "Look at the elegance, the class. She does not come home smelling like diesel fuel and sweat from a grimy military uniform. She knows how to treat a successful man." The cruelty was intentional, layered thickly to elicit a hysterical reaction. But I remained perfectly still, my expression neutral, letting them dig their own graves with every word they spoke. Then Richard delivered what he thought was the final lethal blow. He placed his hand flat against Brittany's stomach, looking at me with pure malice. "Brittany is pregnant," he announced, his chest puffing out with pride. "We are starting a real family. And since my lawyer pulled some strings for the fast-track divorce, we are getting married in exactly 3 days. I want you out of my house by the time we get back from the courthouse. You can pack your cheap military gear and leave." The silence in the room was deafening. They stood there united in their cruelty, waiting for the tears, the begging, the dramatic meltdown. They expected a reaction that would validate their twisted narrative and make them feel powerful, but I gave them absolutely nothing. Instead, I calmly opened the manila folder and began to read the divorce settlement. My heart beat steadily beneath my hospital gown as my eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. Richard had clearly hired an aggressive lawyer to strip me of everything he believed held value. The paperwork explicitly stated that Richard would retain sole ownership of the primary residence and the primary vehicle, assuming all associated liabilities. He had meticulously detailed how I would forfeit any claim to his retirement accounts and his personal savings. He wanted to leave me destitute, struggling to survive on my military reserve pay. But then I reached the final page of the agreement, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud in his face. In his absolute desperation to protect his own meager assets and secure the house quickly, Richard had blindly signed a massive boilerplate waiver clause. The clause explicitly stated that he relinquished any and all rights to my limited liability company's private corporate assets and independent business holdings. Richard had signed it without a single second thought because in his arrogant mind, my side businesses were just worthless hobbies. He thought my corporate entities were just hollow shells for my military reserve stipends. He had absolutely no idea that Apex Defense Tech was a highly profitable government contractor valued in the tens of millions. He had no idea that the very house he was so desperately fighting to keep was actually a commercial corporate asset owned entirely by my company, subsidized as an executive perk for my convenience. He thought he was paying the mortgage with his own hard-earned money. In reality, he was only paying a tiny 10% fraction of the actual market cost, while my company covered the massive remaining balance every single month. I reached over to the rolling tray beside my hospital bed, picked up a cheap black pen, and signed my name on the dotted line. I flipped to the next page and signed again, verifying my consent to the terms. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the devastation Richard was so desperately hoping to witness. I closed the thick folder, smoothed out the edges, and held it out to him with a perfectly steady hand. "Congratulations, Richard," I said, my voice eerily calm and composed. "You get exactly what you asked for today. The house and the luxury SUV are all yours, along with every single financial liability attached to them. I hope you have a truly beautiful wedding." Richard snatched the folder from my hand, a look of fleeting confusion crossing his face at my complete lack of resistance. He had prepared for a massive fight, and my quiet acceptance clearly unsettled him for a fraction of a second. But his massive ego quickly paved over the doubt. He smirked, pulling Brittany closer. "I told you she would cave immediately," he whispered to her, intentionally speaking loud enough for me to hear. "She knows she cannot afford to fight me in court." They turned their backs on me and walked out of the hospital room, their shared laughter echoing down the hallway. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet recovery ward. I reached for my phone and dialed my attorney, Bradley. "My husband just signed the waiver," I said, a cold smile breaking across my face. "Initiate the corporate asset clawback protocol immediately. Give him exactly 72 hours to enjoy his illusion." The drive from the hospital to Oak Brook was a blur of calculated silence. I had checked myself out against medical advice, my side burning with every bump, because leaving my personal documents inside that house was a liability I could not afford. The Tudor-style mansion loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac, a monument to Richard's towering ego. He always paraded this property as his ultimate achievement, a physical manifestation of his superiority over my supposedly meager military existence. When I pushed open this heavy oak door, the illusion of a peaceful departure shattered instantly. Loud, mocking laughter echoed down the hallway from the master bedroom. I took a steadying breath, ignoring the throbbing ache in my healing abdomen, and marched up the curved mahogany staircase to claim what was mine. I stepped into the master bedroom to find a scene of deliberate disrespect. My clothing had been ripped from the closet and thrown haphazardly into cheap black trash bags. Standing in the center of the room, holding one of my combat boots with an expression of sheer disgust, was my sister-in-law, Vanessa. She dropped the boot onto the hardwood floor and crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets catching the afternoon light. She had rushed over the moment Richard called her to secure his victory. "Look who decided to show up," Vanessa sneered, kicking a trash bag toward my feet. "Richard told me you signed the papers without a fight. Honestly, Diana, it is for the best. You never belonged in a neighborhood like this anyway. This house requires class, not a military grunt who thinks a $3,000 paycheck is something to be proud of." I stared at her, my expression entirely impassive. Vanessa had spent 4 years treating me like a charity case, constantly boasting about her country club memberships, while treating my military service as some embarrassing blue-collar hobby. She thrived on tearing other women down to elevate her own hollow status. "Brittany is going to be so much better for him," Vanessa continued, pacing the room with a triumphant smirk. "She understands how to host a proper dinner party. She knows how to compliment a successful man in finance. You just wore combat boots and brought his status down. Pack the rest of your cheap things and get out before Richard gets back. We are calling a cleaning crew tonight to scrub the smell of camouflage out of these carpets." I did not raise my voice or offer the defensive argument she desperately craved. Before Vanessa could launch into another venomous insult, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "That is enough, Vanessa." Jamal, her husband, stepped into the bedroom. Jamal was a brilliant African-American certified public accountant who managed the portfolios for several high-net-worth clients. He possessed a sharp, analytical mind and an unwavering sense of integrity that deeply contrasted with the toxic entitlement of his wife's family. He was the only person in Richard's inner circle who had ever treated me with genuine respect. Jamal walked past his wife, completely ignoring her indignant scoff, and crouched down to carefully fold my scattered uniforms. "I am sorry about this, Diana," he said quietly, his deep voice offering a grounding presence in the chaotic room. "You just had surgery. You should not be lifting heavy boxes. Point out what you need, and I will carry these to the car for you." "Do not help her, Jamal." Vanessa snapped, her voice pitching into a shrill command. "Richard wants her out immediately. We are supposed to be supporting my brother, not the woman who held him back." Jamal stood up, his broad shoulders squared, leveling a look of profound disappointment at his wife. "Supporting your brother does not require stripping a recovering patient of her basic human dignity," he replied firmly. Just then, heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. Richard burst into the bedroom aggressively, waving a stack of freshly printed legal documents in his right hand. He was practically vibrating with arrogance, completely blind to the thick tension in the room. He marched straight over to his sister and high-fived her, a grotesque display of victory. "The judge expedited the initial filings," Richard boasted loudly. "The title transfer requests are already in motion. This house and the SUV are officially locked under my sole liability." Jamal frowned, his professional instincts instantly kicking in. He stepped closer to Richard and gestured toward the legal paperwork. "Let me see those transfer requests, Richard." Jamal requested, his tone shifting into the meticulous cadence of a seasoned auditor. Richard rolled his eyes, but handed the papers over, eager to show off his absolute triumph. Jamal adjusted his glasses and quickly scanned the dense paragraphs detailing the property's financial structure. The room grew quiet as Jamal's brow furrowed into a deep, troubled expression. He flipped to the second page, tracing a line of text with his index finger. "Richard, this title transfer does not make any sense." Jamal warned, his voice tight with genuine concern. "You signed a liability waiver for a residential deed, but this property is listed under a commercial holding entity. The tax structures and depreciation schedules here are massive. This is a corporate asset. Are you absolutely certain you know what you just agreed to?" Richard snatched the documents back from Jamal's hands, his face flushing with defensive anger. His fragile masculinity could never handle being corrected, especially by his brother-in-law. "I know exactly what I agreed to," Richard shouted, stepping aggressively into Jamal's personal space. "I pay the mortgage on this house every single month with my own hard-earned corporate salary. I bought this property. I earned this lifestyle. Do not come into my house and try to undermine my financial literacy just because you like playing with spreadsheets all day. You are just an accountant, Jamal. I am a senior financial manager. I think I understand how a basic deed transfer works." Jamal took a slow, measured breath, maintaining his absolute professionalism despite the blatant disrespect. "A senior manager should know the difference between a standard mortgage and a commercial lease agreement," Jamal replied coolly. "But it is your signature, Richard, your funeral." I stood silently near the doorway, watching the entire exchange with a calm, predatory focus. Jamal was brilliant, and his instincts were absolutely correct. He had spotted the exact trap Richard had so blindly walked into. What Richard fiercely believed was a standard monthly mortgage payment of $3,000 was actually just a tiny 10% fraction of the true operating cost. My company, Apex Defense Tech, owned the Tudor mansion outright. The board subsidized 90% of the property's massive commercial value as an exclusive executive housing perk for my convenience. Richard was effectively paying a fractional utility fee, utterly convinced he was funding a millionaire lifestyle. By signing that fast-track divorce agreement and aggressively claiming full legal liability for the property, Richard had legally obligated himself to pay the entire commercial buyout price. He had absolutely no idea he was now bound to a massive corporate invoice he could never possibly afford. I did not correct Richard. I did not offer a single word of warning. I let his towering arrogance seal his absolute destruction. I picked up my lightweight duffel bag containing my essential documents and personal electronics. Jamal immediately stepped forward and effortlessly lifted the two heavy boxes containing the rest of my belongings. "I will walk you out, Diana," Jamal offered deliberately, turning his back on his fuming wife and her arrogant brother. "Thank you, Jamal," I said softly, meaning it more than he could possibly know. As I walked down the hallway, Vanessa shouted from the bedroom, "Do not ever come back here. You are dead to this family." I kept walking, my spine perfectly straight, refusing to look back. Jamal loaded the boxes into the trunk of a modest rental car I had secured on my way from the hospital. He closed the trunk and looked at me with a solemn, respectful nod. "Take care of yourself, Diana," Jamal said against the cool wind. "You are walking away from a disaster, and you are smart enough to know that." I offered him a genuine smile. "Protect your own assets, Jamal. You will need them." I climbed into the rental car and pulled out of the driveway, leaving the Tudor mansion behind. I parked 2 blocks away under an oak tree and checked my phone. A text message from Richard blinked on the screen. "Throwing out your cheap sheets right now. Redecorating the master bedroom for Brittany today. Thanks for leaving quietly." I did not reply. I reached into my bag and pulled out my corporate tablet. I logged into the secure personnel portal, selected my profile, and clicked Richard's name under authorized dependents. I pressed revoke. The financial trap was now officially set. His total ruin had begun. The crystal chandeliers of the bridal boutique cast a blinding light over the imported Italian lace. Brittany spun in front of the tall mirror, admiring a custom gown that cost more than a compact car. "It has to be this one, Richard," she insisted, her voice echoing through the private showroom. "And we need to upgrade the reception florals to imported orchids. My friends expect a luxury experience." Richard leaned back on the plush velvet sofa, swirling a glass of complimentary champagne. He felt like an absolute king. "Whatever you want, babe. We are upgrading everything. Cost is not an issue." He pulled his heavy metallic premium credit card from his wallet and handed it to the boutique manager with a smug flick of his wrist. He was entirely unaware that the card in his hand was directly linked to my corporate accounts. He had spent years assuming it was simply a joint perk tied to his own modest credit score. The boutique manager smiled politely and walked over to the terminal. A minute passed, then 2. The manager returned her professional smile, straining at the edges. I apologize, sir, but the card has been declined. Richard's smug expression vanished instantly. Excuse me, try it again. It must be a fraud alert. My bank is notoriously strict about large, sudden purchases to protect my assets. The manager ran the card again. The machine let out a sharp negative beep. Declined, sir. The terminal states the account has been permanently frozen by the primary cardholder. Brittany stopped spinning in front of the mirror, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. Richard, what is going on? You promised the venue and the dress would be handled today. It is just a glitch. Richard snapped, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. He snatched the card back, avoiding the cashier's judgmental gaze. I will call my wealth manager right now and sort this out. Just wrap the dress up. He stormed out of the showroom, pulling his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking with sudden, inexplicable panic. 200 miles away in Washington, D.C., the heavy door of a bulletproof town car swung open. I stepped onto the red carpet leading into the grand ballroom of the National Defense Gala. There were no combat boots tonight. I wore a custom emerald silk gown, my posture carrying the absolute authority of a woman who commanded rooms filled with generals and politicians. The flash of cameras illuminated the night as I bypassed the standard entry line, escorted directly through the VIP security checkpoint. Inside the ballroom, the air buzzed with high-stakes networking. I held a glass of sparkling water, quietly discussing a multi-million-dollar satellite logistics contract with a 4-star general. My secure smartwatch vibrated gently against my wrist. I glanced down, reading the automated alert from the Apex Defense Tech Financial Department. Attempted transaction of $18,000 at a bridal boutique declined. Account access revoked. A small, satisfied smile played across my lips. Richard was finally hitting the brick wall of reality, entirely blind to the fact that his supposed empire was nothing but a fragile house of cards I had built, and just as easily torn down. I slipped my phone back into my clutch. I turned my full attention back to the general, projecting the immense power and stability of a chief executive officer, earning nearly $1 million a year. Standing on the sidewalk outside the bridal boutique, Richard frantically dialed the one person he thought could save him. The phone rang 3 times before his brother-in-law answered. Jamal, I need a massive favor right now, Richard demanded, pacing back and forth, entirely skipping a greeting. My bank put a ridiculous hold on my primary account, and Brittany is waiting inside for her dress. I need you to wire me $50,000 immediately. I will pay you back on Monday, once the bank clears the fraud lock. On the other end of the line, Jamal sat in his accounting office, staring at a spread of financial documents. Absolutely not, Richard, Jamal replied, his deep voice radiating professional authority. I warned you yesterday when I looked at those mortgage transfer papers. The financial structure of your life makes 0 sense. You do not own that house. You do not control those assets. You are living so far beyond your means that you are practically begging for bankruptcy. I am not throwing $50,000 of my hard-earned money into your sinking ship. Richard gripped his phone, his knuckles turning white. You listen to me, Jamal. I make $90,000 a year. I am a senior manager. I am good for it. You are just being paranoid because you do not understand high-level wealth management. I am a certified public accountant, Jamal shot back, refusing to let the insult slide. I understand exactly what financial ruin looks like, and you are staring right at it. Call the wedding off, Richard. Figure out what is actually going on with your accounts. Before Jamal could hang up, a sharp voice cut through the background. Vanessa had walked into the home office and snatched the phone directly from his hand. Richard, what is happening? She asked urgently. Richard quickly spun his lie, claiming his bank made a clerical error and Jamal was being unsupportive. The toxic loyalty Vanessa held for her brother instantly flared. She glared at her husband, completely overriding his professional and personal boundaries. Do not listen to him, Richard, Vanessa promised loudly, deliberately, making sure Jamal heard every word. Jamal is just jealous because he does not have your kind of executive status. I will wire you the $50,000 right now from our joint savings account. You go give Brittany the lavish wedding she deserves. Jamal stood up from his desk, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated fury. Vanessa, if you touch that joint account, you are crossing a line we cannot come back from, he warned, his voice dangerously low. That money is for our future, not your arrogant brother and his fake lifestyle. Vanessa scoffed, already tapping furiously on her banking app. My brother is Family Jamal. He is a successful man who just hit a temporary bump. I am sending the wire. She hit confirm, completely ignoring the massive rift she had just torn through her own marriage. Back at the boutique, Richard felt his phone chime with a deposit notification. The stolen $50,000 had landed in his checking account. He let out a massive sigh of relief, his fragile ego instantly repairing itself. He squared his shoulders, marched back into the luxurious showroom, and handed his debit card to the cashier. Run this one, Richard commanded, flashing a victorious smile at Brittany. Told you it was just a stupid banking error. The venue, the imported flowers, the dress, it is all completely handled. Brittany beamed, throwing her arms around his neck, entirely convinced she was marrying a man of immense wealth and power. Richard believed he had brilliantly dodged a bullet, entirely unaware that he had just forced his sister to finance his delusion using stolen money. Hundreds of miles away, the Washington Gala was winding down. I stepped away from the ballroom floor and walked out onto the private balcony overlooking the city monuments. I pulled my phone from my clutch and dialed my corporate attorney. Bradley answered on the first ring. The event is going beautifully, I told him, resting my hands on the cool marble railing. But I need you to initiate the next phase of the corporate asset protocol. Understood, Bradley replied, the sound of typing echoing through the receiver. Richard signed the fast-track divorce papers, assuming full legal liability for the suburban property. Since you have officially revoked his authorized dependent status, he is now occupying a commercial corporate asset without permission. Exactly, I said, a cold smile forming as I watched the distant traffic. Prepare the commercial lease buyout invoice for the property. He wants the house so badly he can buy it from my company at the full market rate of $1.2 million. Or he can pay the true commercial rent of $20,000 a month. Tape the heavy red envelope directly to the front door on the night of his wedding. Let it be the very first thing he sees when he carries his new bride across the threshold. The invoice will be legally binding, Bradley confirmed. He trapped himself when he demanded everything. I hung up the phone and looked out over the glittering skyline, savoring the absolute control I held over my own destiny. Richard had just bought himself a luxurious wedding using stolen money, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial avalanche currently speeding right toward him. He thought he had outsmarted a mere logistics officer blind to the corporate powerhouse he had crossed. His downfall was sealed. The third day broke with the false promise of a fairy tale. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a masterclass in performative wealth, with its sprawling manicured greens and towering marble pillars. Richard had spared absolutely no expense, or rather he had spared no expense using the $50,000 his sister had stolen from her own marriage. The grand ballroom was draped in cascading white orchids and imported silk linens exactly as Brittany had demanded. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne, catering to a crowd of guests who were entirely oblivious to the financial fraud funding their entertainment. Richard stood at the center of the ballroom holding a crystal flute, basking in the absolute admiration of Brittany's social circle. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that hugged his shoulders, projecting the image of a seasoned titan of industry. Brittany's friends clustered around him, marveling at the sheer scale of the reception. You really outdid yourself, Richard, one of her bridesmaids gushed, taking in the towering six-tier wedding cake adorned with edible gold leaf. Brittany hit the absolute jackpot with you. Richard chuckled, a deep, resonant sound of pure arrogance. I believe a man should give his bride the world, he proclaimed smoothly, wrapping his arm around Brittany's waist. It is just a matter of knowing how to leverage your success. When you work at my level in finance, this kind of event is just the standard baseline. Brittany beamed, leaning into him, entirely convinced she had married a tycoon. She flaunted her diamond ring to her friends, bragging about the European honeymoon Richard had promised to book by the end of the week. Richard soaked in the adoration, his ego expanding to fill the massive room. He felt invincible. He had successfully divorced the military grunt holding him back, secured a magnificent suburban mansion, and thrown the wedding of the century. He honestly believed he was a master strategist who had played the system perfectly. As the string quartet transitioned into an upbeat tempo, Richard felt his phone vibrate in his tuxedo jacket. He pulled it out, expecting a congratulatory message from a colleague. Instead, his screen displayed an automated alert from his premier auto insurance provider. He frowned, stepping away from the crowd to read the notification. The subject line read, "Urgent Policy Cancellation Notice." Richard tapped the email, his eyes scanning the brief automated text. It stated that the comprehensive insurance policy on his luxury SUV had been immediately terminated. The reason listed was a mandatory cancellation due to a change in corporate ownership status by the primary title holder, Apex Defense Tech. Richard stared at the glowing screen for several seconds. A tiny flicker of confusion crossed his face. Corporate ownership, Apex Defense Tech. He muttered the unfamiliar company name under his breath. He had never heard of it. As far as he knew, the SUV was registered through a standard dealership financing program. He assumed it was just another irritating administrative error, much like the temporary freeze on his credit card the day before. He scoffed, shaking his head at the sheer incompetence of modern banking systems. "Stupid glitch," Richard whispered to himself, completely dismissing the catastrophic warning staring him right in the face. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, refusing to let a clerical error ruin his perfect day. He would simply have his assistant call the insurance company on Monday to straighten out their messy paperwork. His ego demanded that he return to the party, to the adoring crowd, to the illusion of his immense power. He walked back to the dance floor, pouring himself another glass of vintage champagne, entirely prioritizing his pride over the glaring red flag. Across the ballroom, the heavy oak doors swung open, shattering the festive atmosphere for anyone paying close attention. Jamal walked into the reception, and his presence carried the weight of an approaching thunderstorm. He was not dressed in a celebratory tuxedo. He wore a dark business suit, his tie loosened, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute fury. Jamal had just spent the last 2 hours tearing apart his personal accounting ledgers after a fraud alert triggered on his phone. He had tracked the missing $50,000 directly to an unauthorized wire transfer initiated by his own wife. Vanessa was standing near the towering wedding cake, holding a glass of wine and loudly praising her brother's success when she spotted her husband marching across the floor. The color completely drained from her face. She set her glass down so quickly that champagne splashed over the rim. She hurried toward him, plastering on a fake, desperate smile to avoid drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. "Jamal, what are you doing here?" Vanessa hissed under her breath, grabbing his arm and trying to steer him toward a secluded hallway near the coat check. "You are not dressed for the reception. People are staring." Jamal did not yield to her physical pull. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, his dark eyes blazing with a cold, professional anger that terrified her. He pulled a printed bank statement from his inner jacket pocket and shoved it directly into her hands. $50,000, Vanessa." Jamal said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the distant sound of the wedding band. "I log into our joint savings to authorize a quarterly tax payment, and I find a massive, unauthorized wire transfer sent straight to your brother's checking account." Vanessa stumbled over her words, her confident country club facade crumbling instantly. "Jamal, please keep your voice down." Richard was in a terrible bind. His bank made an error with his accounts and Brittany was waiting for her dress. He needed a temporary loan to secure the venue. He promised he will pay it back with interest the second his accounts clear on Monday. "His accounts did not make an error," Jamal fired back, refusing to let her spin the narrative. "I looked at his financial transfer requests yesterday. Your brother is living a complete lie. He has no assets, Vanessa. He does not own that house. He does not own that car. He is entirely dependent on corporate structures he does not even understand. You did not give him a loan. You threw our future into a burning fire to protect his fragile male ego." Vanessa crossed her arms defensively, desperately clinging to her blind family loyalty. You are overreacting, Jamal. Richard is a senior financial manager. He makes $90,000 a year. He is good for it. He is my brother, and I had to protect him from being humiliated on his wedding day. You chose your arrogant brother over our marriage, Jamal stated, delivering the words with absolute devastating clarity. I am a certified public accountant. My entire career is built on financial integrity, and you just committed massive marital financial fraud to fund a party. Jamal stepped closer, towering over her with righteous indignation. You listen to me very carefully, Vanessa. You have exactly 48 hours to get every single cent of that $50,000 back from Richard. If that money is not sitting in our joint account by Tuesday morning, I am legally separating our finances entirely, and I will be calling my lawyer to draw up separation papers. I will not let your toxic obsession with your brother drag me into bankruptcy. Vanessa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Jamal, you cannot be serious. You would threaten our marriage over a temporary loan. It is not a loan, and I am dead serious, Jamal replied coldly. Get the money back, or we are done. He turned on his heel and walked straight out of the country club, refusing to spend another second celebrating a wedding built on stolen funds. Vanessa stood frozen in the hallway, her heart pounding against her ribs. Panic set in. She looked back toward the ballroom, where Richard was currently giving a pompous, boisterous toast to his new bride, promising her a lifetime of luxury and ease. A sickening knot formed in Vanessa's stomach. She knew she had to demand the money back, but doing so right now would destroy the perfect image Richard was so desperately projecting. The entire reception became a living nightmare for her. While the guests danced and drank the expensive champagne she had unknowingly paid for, Vanessa paced the perimeter of the room, biting her nails, watching her marriage hang by a thread. Richard remained blissfully unaware of the catastrophic damage unfolding around him. He danced with Brittany, cut the massive cake, and accepted the envious congratulations of his peers. He felt like the absolute master of his universe. He had won. He had defeated his ex-wife, claimed the ultimate suburban prize, and secured a beautiful new bride. As midnight approached, the lavish reception finally drew to a close. The guests lined the exit of the country club, lighting sparklers to cheer for the newlyweds. Richard dipped Brittany for a picture-perfect kiss as the cameras flashed, sealing the illusion of their grand romance. They walked hand in hand toward the luxury SUV parked at the valet stand, entirely ignorant to the fact that the insurance policy shielding the vehicle had been voided hours ago. Richard opened the door for Brittany, sliding into the driver's seat and revving the engine. Next stop, our beautiful new home, he promised her with a dazzling smile. He pulled out of the country club, driving through the quiet, darkened streets toward the Oak Brook suburbs. Unbeknownst to them, the wheels of ultimate consequence were already turning. Across the city, a heavy-duty corporate towing company had received a direct authorized dispatch from Apex Defense Tech. The flatbed tow truck was currently mobilizing, navigating the quiet suburban streets with precise instructions to retrieve a specific corporate vehicle. And waiting for them at the Tudor-style mansion, firmly taped to the center of the heavy oak front door, was a thick, unmissable red envelope. It held the crushing weight of reality, containing a legally binding commercial invoice that would systematically destroy every single lie Richard had ever told. The fairy tale was officially over. The brutal reckoning had arrived. The morning sun filtered through the imported silk curtains of the master bedroom, casting a warm and deceitful glow over Richard as he woke on the fourth day. He stretched his arms wide across the premium mattress, reveling in the quiet luxury of the Tudor-style mansion he now fully believed was his own undisputed kingdom. Brittany slept soundly beside him, her diamond ring catching the morning light in a brilliant flash of stolen wealth. Richard slipped out of bed, threw on a plush cashmere robe, and walked barefoot down the curved mahogany staircase to brew a cup of expensive artisan coffee. He felt entirely untouchable. He had executed his grand plan flawlessly, securing a beautiful new bride and a massive estate while forcefully discarding the military grunt who had dragged down his social standing for years. He took his steaming mug to the front bay window, proudly pulling back the heavy velvet drapes to admire his pristine suburban domain. His confident smile vanished instantly. The wide paved driveway was completely empty. Richard blinked hard, pressing his face closer to the cold glass pane. The luxury SUV was gone. A sudden sharp spike of panic tightened his chest as he dropped his coffee mug onto the windowsill, spilling dark liquid across the pristine white trim. He sprinted to the front hallway, his mind racing through a dozen impossible scenarios. Car thieves did not target this specific gated community. The neighborhood watch was far too strict, and the security patrols were constant. He yanked the heavy oak front door open, intending to storm out into the driveway to search for broken glass or tire tracks. Instead, his chest collided with a thick, heavy red envelope firmly taped to the center of the wood at eye level. Richard staggered back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The envelope was entirely unmarked on the outside, sealed with a thick wax stamp, bearing a corporate crest he did not immediately recognize. He ripped the envelope off the door, his hands trembling with a sudden, inexplicable dread. He tore through the thick paper, pulling out a stack of crisp, watermarked legal documents. The header featured a bold, imposing logo for Apex Defense Tech. The very first page was a formal commercial invoice explicitly addressed to him by his full legal name. Richard scanned the dense paragraphs, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. The document stated that due to his legally binding assumption of all liabilities for the property during the expedited divorce proceedings, the executive housing subsidy previously provided by the corporation had been immediately terminated. Richard was now solely responsible for the immense financial burden of the property. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he reached the financial breakdown at the bottom of the page. The invoice demanded a full commercial buyout price of $1.2 million payable in full within 30 days. If he failed to secure the buyout, he was legally obligated to pay the true commercial market rent of $20,000 a month, effective immediately. Attached to the invoice was a secondary notice regarding the luxury SUV, stating the vehicle had been successfully repossessed by corporate security during the night due to unauthorized operation by a non-employee. The $90,000 a year manager stared at the staggering numbers, his entire reality fracturing into a million jagged pieces. He was holding a catastrophic debt he could never possibly repay in 10 lifetimes. Richard stumbled backward into the grand foyer, dropping the papers onto the hardwood floor as if they were actively burning his hands. He pulled his smartphone from his robe pocket and frantically dialed my number. I let it ring. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer, gazing out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse executive suite. The panoramic view offered a direct, unobstructed sightline to the Pentagon across the Potomac River. My phone buzzed persistently on the polished wood surface. 1 missed call, 5 missed calls, 10 missed calls. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter richness of the roast and the absolute desperation radiating from the vibrating device. On the 15th call, I finally pressed accept and placed the phone on speaker, letting the heavy silence stretch for a long moment. "Diana!" Richard screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. "What kind of sick, fraudulent scam are you running? Someone stole my car in the middle of the night and I just found a fake invoice taped to my front door demanding $1 million. I am calling the police right now and having you arrested for grand larceny." I remained perfectly still, letting his frantic threats echo through the cavernous space of my suite. "You cannot report a corporate asset stolen when the owning entity simply repossesses it, Richard," I replied, my voice a calm, freezing current of absolute authority. "There is no scam. You demanded the house. You demanded the car. You demanded all the liabilities attached to them so you could rush into your new marriage. I simply gave you exactly what you asked for." "I pay the mortgage on this house," he roared, pacing wildly in the suburban foyer, his bare feet slapping against the wood. "I paid $3,000 a month. That is my property." Behind him, Brittany appeared at the top of the staircase, drawn from her sleep by his frantic screaming. She hurried down the steps, pulling her silk robe tightly around her waist. "Who are you yelling at?" Brittany demanded, her eyes darting from his panicked face to the scattered legal documents on the floor. Richard ignored her, keeping the phone on speaker, as he desperately tried to regain control of the crumbling narrative. "You are just a bitter military clerk trying to scare me with fake corporate letterhead," Richard sneered into the phone, though his voice trembled uncontrollably. "I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Defense Tech," I stated clearly, letting the crushing reality crash down upon him with devastating force. "The $3,000 you paid every month was just a tiny 10% fraction of the actual cost. My company subsidized the remaining 90% as an executive perk for my personal convenience. You were living in a commercially owned property, driving a commercially owned vehicle. When you forced me to sign those fast-track divorce papers, you legally assumed the full commercial debt. You owe my company $1.2 million, Richard, and you have 29 days left to pay it." Brittany stopped dead at the bottom of the stairs. The blood completely drained from her face as she processed every single word pouring from the speakerphone. She looked down at the invoice on the floor, her eyes locking onto the $20,000 monthly rent demand. The illusion of her grand wealthy romance shattered instantly. Brittany realized she had not married a titan of finance. She had married a broke, arrogant middle manager who was now buried under an insurmountable mountain of corporate debt. "Richard, tell me she is lying," Brittany demanded, her voice rising in sheer panic. "Tell me you own this house. Tell me you have the money to pay for this." Richard spun around to face her, his eyes wild and completely devoid of his usual smug confidence. "It is a lie, Brittany. She is just a petty, jealous grunt trying to ruin our wedding week. I make good money. I can fix this." He turned back to the phone, his desperation morphing into a vicious, cornered rage. He could not accept that he had been entirely outsmarted. "You think you can play these games with me?" Richard snarled, his breath hitching as his entire world collapsed around his ears. "You think you can forge documents and steal my car? I know exactly where your dingy little army base is. I am driving down there right now with my sister and my wife. I am going to march straight into your commanding officer's quarters and report you for massive financial fraud. I will have you stripped of your rank. I will have you court-martialed. You are going to lose your pathetic little $3,000 paycheck, and you will end up rotting in a military prison for doing this to me." Brittany began to sob hysterically in the background, screaming at Richard that he was a complete fraud and a pathetic failure. She cursed him for deceiving her, realizing her dream of a luxurious life was entirely funded by the woman she had cruelly mocked in the hospital room. Richard yelled back at her, the toxic foundation of their 3-day-old marriage immediately crumbling under the weight of utter financial ruin. I listened to the chaotic screaming implosion of their lives, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. I reached out and tapped the glass surface of my desk. "By all means, Richard, bring your new bride and your sister to my office," I replied, my tone razor-sharp and devoid of any mercy whatsoever. "I will be waiting for you. I will even leave a guest pass for you at the front desk." I ended the call, letting the dial tone ring through his crumbling, stolen kingdom. The dial tone echoed through the grand foyer of the Tudor mansion, a sharp, repetitive sound that signaled the absolute destruction of Richard's carefully curated life. He stood frozen, staring at his phone, while the staggering weight of a $1.2 million debt crashed down upon him. The heavy red envelope lay discarded on the hardwood floor, its contents a glaring testament to his own spectacular ignorance. Brittany broke the silence with a sharp, humorless laugh. She pulled her silk robe tightly around her waist and descended the remaining steps, her eyes narrowed with pure contempt. She stepped over the corporate invoice, refusing to even touch the paper that had just ruined her fairy tale. "A 10% fraction," Brittany said, her voice dripping with venom. "You were paying $3,000 a month and acting like you were a titan of industry. You told me you owned this estate. You told me you bought that luxury vehicle with cash from your massive bonuses. You are nothing but a mid-level manager living on an allowance from your ex-wife." Richard scrambled to regain his footing, his fragile ego desperately trying to patch the gaping holes in his reality. "Brittany, you have to listen to me. he pleaded, taking a step toward her with his hands raised in a placating gesture. Diana is lying. She is a low-level military logistics officer. She probably hacked into a corporate database to forge these documents. She is just trying to scare us because she is bitter that I chose you over her. Brittany crossed her arms, glaring at him with a cold, calculating gaze. She was a woman who traded on appearances and social status, and she recognized a sinking ship when she saw one. I heard her voice on speakerphone, Richard. That was not a bitter ex-wife throwing a tantrum. That was a woman holding all the cards. She repossessed the car in the middle of the night. She sent a legally binding corporate invoice. You do not even own the mattress we slept on last night. You are completely broke. I make $90,000 a year, Richard shouted, his face flushing a deep, angry red. I am a senior financial manager. I can easily hire a lawyer and destroy her for this fraud. We are going to be fine. We just got married 3 days ago. We are building a life together. We are having a baby. The mention of the baby caused a sudden, dangerous shift in the room. Brittany stopped pacing. She looked at Richard, her expression flattening into a mask of sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness. She let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking her head, as if dealing with an incredibly slow child. There is no baby, Richard. Brittany stated clearly, delivering the words with brutal precision. Richard froze. The air vanished from his lungs. What are you talking about? You showed me the positive test. You have been talking about nursery colors for a month. I lied, Brittany replied, entirely unapologetic. I bought a positive test online. I needed you to stop dragging your feet and file the fast-track divorce. I thought you were a wealthy executive who was just too cowardly to leave his boring military wife. I thought securing a marriage to you meant securing a massive fortune. Why would I actually get pregnant before seeing the bank statements? Richard staggered backward, his shoulders hitting the wall. The sheer magnitude of her deception hit him with the force of a freight train. He had thrown away a stable, loyal marriage to a woman who had quietly funded his luxurious lifestyle, all for a manipulative opportunist who only saw him as a walking ATM. Brittany had faked a pregnancy just to expedite the legal process and secure her grasp on assets he did not even own. He had been completely, utterly played. You faked a pregnancy, Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of devastation and profound humiliation. You rushed me into signing those divorce papers. You made me demand this house and the car. Because I thought you were actually rich, Brittany screamed back, abandoning any pretense of affection. I wanted a millionaire Richard. I did not sign up to be married to a fraud who owes a defense company over $1 million. I did not agree to spend my life paying off a $20,000 a month commercial rent demand. You are a complete failure. Before Richard could respond to the devastating insult, the heavy oak front door was violently shoved open. Vanessa burst into the foyer, completely bypassing the doorbell. Her hair was disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled, and her face was a portrait of pure panic. She had driven wildly from her own house after Jamal delivered his final, absolute ultimatum regarding their marriage. Vanessa stopped in her tracks, taking in the chaotic scene. Richard was backed against the wall, pale and shaking, while Brittany glared at him with undisguised hatred. The corporate invoice lay scattered across the floor between them. Richard, I need that $50,000 back right now, Vanessa demanded, her voice shrill and breathless. Jamal is packing his bags. He contacted his lawyer to start drafting separation papers. He is going to completely detach our finances and leave me if I do not return the money to our joint savings account today. You said it was a banking error. You promised you would pay me back. Richard stared at his sister, his mind completely unable to process this new crisis. He ran a trembling hand over his face. Vanessa, I do not have the money. He confessed, his voice barely a hollow whisper. I spent it all on the country club, the imported flowers, and the catering. It is gone. What do you mean it is gone? Vanessa shrieked, marching toward him and grabbing his forearm. You make $90,000 a year. Pull it from your savings. Take out a loan. Do whatever you have to do, but you are not letting my husband divorce me over your wedding. Brittany let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He does not have any savings, Vanessa. The car was just repossessed. This entire house belongs to his ex-wife's defense contracting company, and he currently owes them over $1 million because he signed a liability waiver without reading it. Your brother is flat broke, and I am calling an annulment lawyer the second they open on Monday." Vanessa whipped her head around, staring at Brittany in absolute shock, then looked down at the documents littering the floor. The bold logo of Apex Defense Tech stared back at her. The reality of Jamal's warning slammed into her with brutal clarity. Jamal had been right about everything. Richard was living a complete lie, and she had stolen her own marital savings to fund a pathetic illusion. "You stole my future," Vanessa cried, hitting Richard's chest with her fists. "You told me you were successful. You let me ruin my marriage for your fake lifestyle." Richard caught her wrists, his ego severely bruised and utterly desperate to regain control of the narrative. His entire world was collapsing, and the only way his mind could cope was by projecting all the blame onto the woman who had exposed him. He could not accept that he was the architect of his own destruction. He needed a target. He needed to believe Diana was nothing more than a rogue military clerk who had orchestrated a massive illegal scam. "Stop it!" Richard yelled, pushing Vanessa back and glaring at Brittany. "Diana is lying. Do you hear me? This is all a fabricated scam. She is a low-level reserve officer who makes $3,000 a month. She does not own a defense company. She probably stole corporate letterhead and hacked an insurance database to cancel my policy. It is financial fraud, and I'm going to prove it." Brittany crossed her arms, entirely unconvinced. "She told you to come to her office. She said she would leave a guest pass. And that is exactly what we are going to do," Richard declared, his voice gaining a frantic, manic edge. He was clinging to his delusion with a terrifying ferocity. "We are going to her base. I am going to march straight into the commanding officer's quarters and hand over these forged invoices. When the military sees that she is committing massive financial crimes to harass a civilian, they will court-martial her. She will be stripped of her rank, fired from her miserable job, and sent to federal prison." Vanessa wiped her eyes, her desperate need to save her own marriage making her completely susceptible to his delusion. If Richard could prove this was fraud, maybe he could sue Diana for damages. Maybe he could get the $50,000 back, and she could stop Jamal from filing separation papers. "You really think she is faking this?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling with fragile hope. "I know she is," Richard insisted, grabbing his pants and a dress shirt from a discarded suitcase in the hallway. He pulled his clothes on frantically over his robe. "Diana is a nobody. She spent years holding me back. She wants to ruin me because I upgraded to a better life. Get dressed, Brittany. We are taking Vanessa's car. We are going to drive right down to whatever dingy logistical base she works at, and we are going to watch the military police haul her away in handcuffs." Brittany hesitated, looking at the door. She wanted to walk away to wash her hands of this pathetic mess, but a dark, vindictive curiosity anchored her to the spot. If Richard was actually right, and he could somehow secure damages from a military lawsuit, she wanted her cut for the time she had wasted. And if he was wrong, she wanted front-row seats to watch his final spectacular destruction. "Fine," Brittany said coldly, turning toward the stairs to get dressed. "But if this is a bust, Richard, I am walking away, and I am taking whatever I can carry." 15 minutes later, the three of them piled into Vanessa's sedan. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was highly combustible, thick with resentment, panic, and manic denial. Richard sat in the passenger seat, gripping the red envelope and the corporate invoice like a weapon. He dictated the address I had provided over the phone, feeding it into the GPS navigation system on the dashboard. He fully expected the automated voice to guide them toward a remote, heavily guarded military checkpoint or a rundown logistical depot on the outskirts of the city. He was entirely prepared to demand justice from a stern military general. He was completely blind to the fact that they were currently speeding straight toward the gleaming high-security corporate sector of downtown, driving directly into the impenetrable fortress I had meticulously built from the ground up. The automated voice of the navigation system echoed through the tense silence of Vanessa's sedan, announcing that they had arrived at their destination. Richard leaned forward, scowling through the windshield. His eyes darted back and forth across the pristine sunlit street. He expected to see a rusted chain-link fence, a drab concrete recruitment center, or perhaps a rundown logistical depot tucked away in some forgotten industrial park. Instead, the vehicle was idling in the very heart of the elite corporate sector, directly in the shadow of a towering state-of-the-art skyscraper. The massive structure was a breathtaking monolith of dark, reflective glass and brushed steel, soaring dozens of stories into the clear morning sky. At the street level, a sleek titanium monument displayed the name of the complex in bold, imposing letters: Apex Defense Tech. Vanessa put the car in park, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stared up at the sheer scale of the building, a sudden wave of nausea twisting her stomach. Brittany sat frozen in the back seat, taking in the immaculate landscaping and the presence of heavily armed professional security personnel patrolling the perimeter. Richard shook his head, letting out a harsh, dismissive scoff. He refused to let the intimidating architecture puncture his fragile delusion. "The GPS must have made an error," Richard snapped aggressively, tapping the digital map on his phone. "Or this is a multi-tenant commercial complex. Diana probably works in a windowless supply closet in the basement processing inventory requests for some low-level military contractor. Park the car, Vanessa. We are going inside." Vanessa swallowed hard, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She did not want to step foot out of her vehicle. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to drive away. But the crushing weight of the $50,000 she had stolen from Jamal anchored her to her brother's sinking ship. She needed Richard to be right. She needed him to secure a financial settlement from whatever lawsuit he planned to threaten, or her marriage would be entirely destroyed by Tuesday morning. With trembling hands, she turned off the ignition. The three of them stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk, immediately feeling the crushing disparity between their chaotic personal lives and the absolute precision of the environment they were entering. Richard adjusted his wrinkled dress shirt, trying to project the aura of an authoritative executive. He marched toward the towering glass doors, forcing Brittany and Vanessa to hurry after him. As they approached the entrance, two security guards in tailored black suits stepped aside, their expressions unreadable. They walked into the grand lobby, and the sheer magnitude of the wealth on display struck them like a physical blow. The floor was crafted from seamless imported marble. The ceiling stretched 3 stories high, featuring a custom light installation that resembled a constellation of stars. Sleek biometric security gates controlled access to the elevators, and dozens of sharply dressed professionals moved through the space with quiet, urgent purpose. From my penthouse suite, I watched their arrival on a secure monitor connected directly to the lobby surveillance feed. I took a slow sip of my coffee, observing the exact moment Richard's swagger faltered. I saw him crane his neck to look at the massive corporate crest displayed behind the front desk. I watched Brittany subtly shrink behind his shoulder, her eyes darting nervously across the expansive room. They looked entirely out of place, like trespassers who had wandered into a fortress they could not possibly comprehend. Richard swallowed his hesitation and marched directly up to the main reception desk. He slapped his hand against the polished stone counter, demanding the attention of the imposing, broad-shouldered head of security standing guard. "I am here to see the commanding officer," Richard demanded, his voice overly loud, attempting to mask his growing insecurity. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge of your military reserve logistics personnel. I am here to report an officer named Diana for massive financial fraud, identity theft, and corporate harassment. I want her pulled from her desk immediately." The head of security did not flinch. He did not ask for clarification. He simply looked Richard up and down with a slow, deliberate assessment, noting the wrinkled clothes and the frantic energy radiating from him. A subtle, highly professional smirk touched the corner of the security chief's mouth. He already knew exactly who this man was. I had given explicit instructions for this very moment. "Name, please?" the security chief asked, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that offered no accommodation for Richard's arrogant tone. "Richard," he barked, standing tall. "I am her husband, and this is her sister-in-law and my wife." The chaotic, contradictory introduction hung in the air, a pathetic testament to the absolute disaster of his personal life. The security chief tapped a few keys on his sleek terminal. He did not ask for their identification or instruct them to take a seat in the waiting area. Instead, he reached under the counter and retrieved 3 heavy metallic visitor badges attached to black lanyards. The badges were not standard paper slips. They were premium VIP access credentials distinctly marked with gold lettering. "Ah, yes, we have been expecting you," the security chief stated smoothly, sliding the credentials across the marble counter. "You have been cleared for absolute unrestricted access to the executive penthouse level. Please secure these badges around your necks. You will be escorted directly to the suite." Richard snatched the badges, a triumphant grin breaking across his face. He turned back to Vanessa and Brittany, holding the credentials up like a hard-won prize. "You see," Richard boasted, his chest puffing out, "I told you she was trying to play us. The military takes fraud seriously. The commanding officer probably flagged her file the second I called. They are rolling out the red carpet because they know I have the evidence to put her away. Put these on. We are going to the top." Brittany took the heavy metal badge, her fingers tracing the gold lettering. The cold weight of the credential did not feel like a ticket to justice. It felt like a meticulously laid trap. Vanessa secured the lanyard around her neck, her hands shaking so violently she could barely operate the clasp. A security officer stepped out from behind the desk, silently gesturing for them to follow. He led them past the biometric gates, waving a master keycard to grant them access to a secluded private hallway. At the end of the corridor was a single dedicated elevator. Its doors were crafted from tinted reinforced glass, offering a panoramic view of the city as it ascended the exterior of the skyscraper. The security officer ushered them inside, pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner on the control panel, and stepped back out. "The car will take you directly to the top floor," he instructed. "Do not attempt to exit until the doors open automatically at the penthouse." The heavy glass doors slid shut, sealing the 3 of them inside the transparent chamber. The elevator engaged with a completely silent, powerful surge of kinetic energy, shooting upward at a terrifying speed. The ground floor rapidly vanished beneath them, the bustling city streets shrinking into tiny grids. As they climbed higher and higher into the sky, the undeniable reality of the building's immense wealth began to crush the oxygen out of the small cabin. Brittany backed into the corner, pressing her hands against the cool glass. She looked out at the sprawling metropolis, realizing they were passing the roofs of neighboring commercial towers. This was not a shared office space. This was not a basement supply closet. This entire towering fortress belonged to a single, staggeringly powerful entity. "Richard," Brittany whispered, her voice trembling with mounting terror. "This is a private executive elevator. Do you understand how much money it costs to secure an entire penthouse in a building like this? This is not a military base. We are walking into a billionaire's corporate headquarters." Vanessa gripped the handrail, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The $50,000 she had stolen felt like pocket change compared to the astronomical wealth flying past them. "She is right, Richard. Something is terribly wrong here. If Diana is just a clerk, why do they have VIP badges waiting for us? Why are we being sent to the penthouse? We need to go back down. We need to leave right now." "Stop panicking!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking as he paced the confined space of the ascending elevator. He aggressively pulled at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead. His mind was violently rejecting every single piece of evidence surrounding him. "You are letting her mind games get to you. She is a $3,000 a month reserve officer. That is a fact. The commanding officer is just using a nice office. We have the red envelope. We have the proof that she canceled my insurance. I am not backing down until she is in handcuffs." Brittany stared at him fully, realizing the profound depth of his delusion. Richard was not a mastermind. He was a blind, arrogant fool, marching straight into a slaughterhouse, dragging them both down with him. The digital floor indicator above the door ticked upward relentlessly. 50, 55, 60. With a soft melodic chime, the high-speed elevator began to decelerate. The sudden shift in momentum made Vanessa's stomach drop. The car came to a perfectly smooth stop, and the tinted glass doors slid open with a quiet, expensive hiss. They stepped out of the elevator and into a sprawling, opulent reception area that radiated absolute power. The floors were lined with rich imported hardwood. Custom museum-quality artwork adorned the pristine walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, breathtaking view of the Potomac River and the Pentagon in the distance. Behind a sleek, curved mahogany desk sat two sharply dressed executive assistants. They did not look surprised by the sudden arrival of the chaotic, disheveled trio. They exuded the calm, intimidating professionalism of individuals who manage the schedules of highly influential power players. One of the assistants stood up, smoothing her tailored skirt. She offered a polite, clinical smile that held absolutely no warmth. "Good morning," she greeted them, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet space. "You are right on time. The chief executive officer has been expecting you. Please follow me." Richard swallowed hard, his throat entirely dry. His bravado was finally beginning to fracture, but he had pushed his chips too far across the table to fold now. He forced his shoulders back, attempting to project a dominance he absolutely did not possess. Brittany and Vanessa trailed behind him, their faces pale silently, preparing for the ultimate reality check. The assistant turned and led them down a wide, sunlit corridor toward a set of massive, imposing double doors. The final reckoning was waiting just on the other side. They walked forward. Richard pushed the heavy mahogany double doors open with aggressive force, expecting to find a sterile military recruitment office or a stern commanding officer ready to hear his complaints. Instead, the doors gave way to a breathtaking, sun-drenched sanctuary of corporate power. The penthouse office spanned the entire corner of the skyscraper, featuring panoramic glass walls that overlooked the sprawling Capitol. A massive custom-built mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by leather seating and sleek digital displays, showing real-time global market data. Sitting behind that desk was not a low-level supply clerk. I sat perfectly centered in an ergonomic leather chair, wearing a bespoke midnight blue designer suit that radiated absolute authority. My hair was impeccably styled, and my posture was relaxed but commanding. I held a platinum fountain pen, calmly signing a stack of multi-million-dollar defense logistics contracts. I did not look up immediately. I let them stand awkwardly in the doorway, letting the sheer magnitude of the wealth and power in the room crush the remaining breath from their lungs. "You are exactly on time, Richard," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly level. I placed my pen down and finally raised my eyes to meet his. "Please come in. I believe you wanted to speak to the person in charge." Richard froze, his hand still gripping the brass door handle. His eyes darted around the opulent office, then snapped back to me. His jaw slackened. The arrogant swagger he had carried into the building instantly evaporated, replaced by a profound, paralyzing confusion. Brittany and Vanessa stood paralyzed behind him, their faces completely drained of color as they processed the reality of the environment. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual booming confidence. "What are you doing sitting at that desk? Where is the commanding officer?" I stood up slowly, buttoning the center button of my blazer, and walked around to the front of the mahogany desk. "I am the commanding officer, Richard," I stated clearly, every word striking like a physical blow. "Allow me to officially introduce myself. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Defense Tech. Welcome to my company." "No," Richard stammered, shaking his head in violent, desperate denial. "That is impossible. You are a military reserve grunt. You make $3,000 a month. You do not own a defense contracting firm. You are lying. This is a massive fraud." I picked up a thick leather-bound portfolio from my desk and tossed it casually onto the glass coffee table in front of them. "I highly recommend you look inside that folder before you make another baseless accusation," I instructed coldly. Richard stumbled forward, his hands trembling violently as he flipped open the heavy cover. The first document was my verified federal tax return from the previous fiscal year. The second was the corporate ownership registration for Apex Defense Tech, clearly listing me as the sole proprietor and majority shareholder. Richard's eyes locked onto the bottom line of the tax return. He physically recoiled, as if the paper had burned him. His breathing turned ragged. The number stared back at him in stark, undeniable black and white. $940,000. My annual take-home income. I watched his fragile, inflated ego shatter into a million jagged pieces right in front of me. $940,000. Brittany read aloud over his shoulder, her voice shrill with shock and mounting fury. She looked at Richard, then at the documents, her entire demeanor transforming into pure hostility. You told me she was broke. You told me you were the one funding your lifestyle. She makes almost $1 million a year. You spent 4 years acting like you were a titan of industry. I told Richard, my tone dripping with icy disdain. You thought your $90,000 salary made you a king. You constantly belittled my military service, treating it like some embarrassing blue-collar hobby, completely blind to the fact that my defense logistics background was the foundation of a highly lucrative government consulting empire. I never needed your money, Richard. You needed mine. You lived in my corporate-owned house, drove a car subsidized by my executive perks, and swiped a premium credit card funded directly by my hard work. Vanessa leaned against the doorframe, visibly trembling. The $50,000 she had stolen from her husband Jamal suddenly felt like an insignificant drop in an ocean of wealth she could not comprehend. Her brother was not a financial genius. He was a complete parasite who had just foolishly discarded his only source of survival. Richard stumbled backward, grasping his chest. You hid this from me, he gasped, trying to shift the blame, desperate to find a way to make me the villain. You deceived me for years. If I had known you were making this kind of money, I never would have filed for divorce. We could have built an empire together. We did not build anything together because you were too busy trying to keep me small, I replied firmly. I walked back behind my desk and picked up a second, thinner file. But your profound ignorance does not just end with our marriage. It extends directly into your own mediocre career. I dropped the second folder onto the desk. Do you recognize this corporate logo, Richard? I asked, tapping the cover. He squinted, his eyes widening as he recognized the insignia of his own boutique finance firm. Your managing partners have been desperately begging for a lucrative consulting contract with Apex Defense Tech for the past 6 months. I revealed, letting the terrifying truth sink in. Your firm has been hemorrhaging clients, and they view my company as their ultimate financial lifeline. Your direct superiors have been emailing my procurement team daily, pleading for a partnership. The blood completely drained from Richard's face. The realization hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. His job, his entire professional livelihood, was entirely dependent on the goodwill of the very company I owned and operated. He had marched into my headquarters intending to destroy my career, utterly oblivious to the fact that I held the absolute power to obliterate his. Diana, please. Richard stammered, his arrogance instantly vanishing, replaced by a pathetic, groveling desperation. He took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating, begging gesture. We need to talk about this. I made a massive mistake. Brittany meant nothing to me. I was just stressed from work and I acted impulsively. We can tear up the divorce papers. The judge has not finalized the decree yet. I will move back into the house today. We can fix our marriage. Brittany let out a sharp, furious shriek, slapping Richard hard on the shoulder. You lying, broke loser, she screamed, abandoning any pretense of affection. You dragged me into this mess, and now you are begging your rich ex-wife to take you back. I held up my hand, instantly silencing the chaotic bickering echoing through my immaculate office. Do not ever insult my intelligence by attempting to crawl back to me, Richard. I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, freezing whisper. You demanded a fast-track divorce because you thought you had secured the ultimate victory. You dragged your pregnant mistress into my hospital room while I was bleeding and healing from surgery just to make sure you could inflict maximum emotional damage. You signed the liability waiver. You took the commercial debt. You severed every single tie we had. I continued, my gaze fixed firmly on his terrified eyes. You thought you were leaving me destitute. You thought I would never recover financially. But the only person who is never going to recover from this monumental disaster is you. Richard opened his mouth to plead again, tears welling in his eyes as the true horror of his situation solidified, but I completely cut him off. Save your pathetic apologies, I stated, gesturing toward the heavy double doors. You came here expecting to find a vulnerable woman you could intimidate and destroy. Instead, you found a chief executive officer who holds the absolute power to dismantle your entire existence with a single phone call. Your fragile ego blinded you to the reality of who I actually am, and now you get to live with the devastating consequences of your own arrogant stupidity. You wanted everything, Richard, and now you have absolutely nothing. I stared at him, letting the cold reality of my words sink deeply into his shattered mind. He stood frozen in the center of my immaculate office, trembling uncontrollably as the luxurious illusion of his life completely evaporated. The magnificent mahogany desk, the panoramic view of the Capitol, and the undeniable proof of my immense wealth all served as a brutal testament to his catastrophic failure. He was now completely trapped in his own irreversible ruin. The heavy mahogany doors to my penthouse office suddenly swung inward, breaking the suffocating silence that had paralyzed the room. Jamal stepped confidently across the threshold. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that practically radiated absolute professional authority. As a highly sought-after African-American certified public accountant, Jamal commanded immense respect in every single corporate environment he entered. He did not look surprised by the chaotic scene unfolding in my suite. He carried himself with the icy precision of a man who dealt exclusively in hard, undeniable facts. Vanessa gasped, a sudden, desperate surge of relief flooding her pale face. She instantly interpreted her husband's unexpected arrival as a miraculous rescue mission. She sprinted across the plush carpet, practically throwing herself toward him, her hands reaching out to grab his tailored lapels. She honestly believed Jamal had rushed down to the corporate district to defend her arrogant brother from my supposed wrath. "Jamal, thank goodness you tracked us down," Vanessa cried out, her voice shrill with frantic entitlement. "You have to stop this absolute madness. Diana has lost her mind. She is trying to claim she owns this entire building. She is threatening to ruin Richard with some fake corporate invoice. Tell her she cannot legally do this to my brother. Use your accounting background to tear her ridiculous scam apart right now." Jamal did not embrace his wife. He did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, he smoothly stepped back, deliberately disengaging from her frantic, clawing grip. His dark eyes remained entirely devoid of the marital warmth she so desperately expected. He looked at her with a profound, chilling disappointment that caused Vanessa to freeze instantly in her tracks. "I am not here to play the role of your supportive husband today, Vanessa," Jamal stated, his deep voice slicing through her delusion like a razor blade. "I am here in my official professional capacity as the lead financial auditor representing the independent firm contracted directly by Apex Defense Tech. I am here to present the finalized forensic audit requested by the Chief Executive Officer." Vanessa stumbled backward, her mouth falling open in sheer, unadulterated shock. Richard whipped his head around, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. He had spent years mocking Jamal's profession, dismissing him as a glorified calculator, entirely blind to the fact that his own brother-in-law held the keys to my corporate financial oversight. Jamal bypassed his trembling wife and walked straight toward my mahogany desk. He offered me a respectful, deferential nod that completely destroyed any lingering doubt about my absolute authority. "Good morning, Madam CEO," Jamal said smoothly, keeping his posture perfectly straight. "I have completed the expedited review of the target accounts." "Thank you, Jamal," I replied calmly, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair. "Please share your findings with the room. I believe Richard could highly benefit from a thorough lesson in basic financial literacy. Jamal unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized binder. He turned to face Richard, who was now sweating profusely, backed into a corner like a trapped animal. Your entire financial existence is a catastrophic liability. Jamal began, his tone surgical and merciless. I spent the last 48 hours tracing the exact origins of your recent expenditures. You assumed the corporate credit card you possessed was tied to your personal credit profile. In reality, it was a restricted auxiliary account funded exclusively by Apex Defense Tech. You completely violated the ethics clauses attached to that account by actively funneling corporate resources to finance your extramarital affair. Jamal flipped open the binder, reading the irrefutable data aloud for everyone to hear. You charged luxurious hotel suites, expensive dinners, and imported jewelry to a business account intended strictly for executive emergency use. You essentially stole corporate funds to court your mistress. Furthermore, the audit confirms you willingly signed a legally binding fast-track divorce decree. You explicitly assumed full sole responsibility for a massive commercial property. Because you utilized fraudulent means to maintain your lifestyle prior to the separation, the company is fully within its rights to demand the immediate commercial lease buyout of $1.2 million. Brittany let out a sharp, furious gasp, her hands balling into tight fists at her sides. She turned her vicious glare toward Richard, her romantic illusion completely pulverized by the relentless barrage of financial reality. You bought my jewelry with her company money, Brittany screamed, her voice echoing off the panoramic glass walls. You paid for our hotel rooms using an account funded by the woman you were actively cheating on. You are the most pathetic, incompetent fraud I have ever met in my entire life. You own absolutely nothing. Richard flinched, opening his mouth to formulate an excuse, but no words came out. His massive, fragile ego had been systematically dismantled, laid bare by the very man he had consistently insulted and belittled at every family gathering. He had nothing left to say. His facade was entirely obliterated. Vanessa, utterly unable to cope with the sheer humiliation crashing down upon her family, directed her blind, venomous rage toward me. She lunged forward, pointing an aggressive finger across my mahogany desk. You orchestrated this entire setup, Vanessa shrieked, her face twisting with bitter resentment. You manipulated my husband into auditing his own family. You brainwashed him into turning against his brother-in-law. You are trying to destroy our entire family just because you are jealous of Richard. Before I could even formulate a response, Jamal swiftly intervened. He stepped directly between my desk and his unhinged wife, forming an impenetrable barrier. Diana did not manipulate anyone, Vanessa, Jamal commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority, instantly shutting down her hysterical tirade. She simply allowed Richard to suffer the immediate consequences of his own monumental arrogance. The only person who destroyed our family today is you. Vanessa recoiled, genuinely startled by the raw intensity of his anger. What are you talking about? She stammered, her hands shaking as she took a defensive step back. I was just trying to protect my brother. Your toxic enablement of your brother has completely ruined our financial future, Jamal stated, delivering the brutal truth without an ounce of hesitation. You deliberately bypassed my warnings. You explicitly stole $50,000 from our joint marital savings account to fund a lavish, fraudulent wedding for a man who is currently buried under $1 million of commercial debt. You prioritized his pathetic ego over our marriage, our security, and my professional integrity. Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes as the catastrophic reality of her impulsive theft finally registered. Jamal, please, she begged, her voice shrinking into a pathetic whimper. He promised he would pay me back on Monday. He said it was just a temporary banking error. I just wanted him to be happy on his wedding day. We can fix this. I will get the money back from him. Look at him, Vanessa, Jamal ordered, gesturing toward the broken, trembling shell of a man cowering in the corner of my office. He has absolutely no money. He has no assets. He is facing potential legal action for corporate fraud. That $50,000 is gone forever, swallowed by catering bills and imported flowers. You burned our life savings to the ground for a man who cannot even afford the shoes on his feet. Jamal adjusted his suit jacket, his expression hardening into a mask of pure self-preserving resolution. I am a certified public accountant. Jamal continued, his voice devoid of any remaining affection. My entire career, my professional license, and my livelihood are dependent on my absolute financial integrity. I cannot and will not remain legally tethered to a woman who commits marital fraud to subsidize her brother's delusions. I refuse to let your family's profound stupidity drag me into a federal corporate investigation. Vanessa let out a strangled, breathless sob. The air completely vanished from her lungs as the ultimate consequence of her blind loyalty crashed into her mind. I am filing for a formal legal separation effective immediately, Jamal announced, delivering the final devastating blow. I have already contacted my attorney to draft the paperwork dividing our remaining assets. You can pack your bags and move into whatever cheap motel Richard can manage to afford. We are entirely finished. Vanessa's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the plush leather sofa in the center of the office, burying her face in her hands as she sobbed hysterically. She had sacrificed her entire marriage, her financial security, and the only decent man who had ever loved her, all to protect an arrogant brother who had absolutely nothing left to offer. She had chosen her toxic family loyalty over her own future, and the price she paid was absolute devastation. Brittany watched the scene unfold with cold detachment. Vanessa remained collapsed on the plush leather sofa, her face buried in her hands, sobbing over the complete destruction of her marriage and her savings. Jamal stood resolutely beside me, his posture radiating unyielding professional integrity. He had delivered the final blow to his own toxic marriage, and he did not waver. The silence in my expansive penthouse office was heavy, broken only by Vanessa sobbing and Richard taking shallow, panicked breaths. He was backed into the corner, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for an escape hatch that simply did not exist. His entire world had just been systematically dismantled by the very people he had spent years treating with absolute contempt. But I was not finished. The financial audit Jamal provided was a devastating weapon, and I fully intended to use every single page of it. I turned away from the pathetic display of Richard cowering in the corner and walked toward the sleek control panel mounted on the mahogany wall behind my desk. I pressed a sequence of buttons. The automatic blackout blinds quietly descended over the panoramic glass windows, plunging the room into a cool, cinematic darkness. A massive high-definition video conferencing screen smoothly lowered from the ceiling, humming with quiet power. Richard jumped at the sound, his head whipping toward the descending screen. His chest heaved as a fresh wave of terror washed over his pale face. He stumbled forward a single step, his hands trembling violently. "Diana, what are you doing?" Richard pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have your house back. You have your car. Jamal already exposed the credit card charges. You proved your point. Just turn the screen off and let us leave." I did not even bother looking at him. I simply tapped the control panel again, initiating a secure, encrypted connection. "I am not proving a point, Richard," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing authority. "I am executing a comprehensive corporate risk assessment. Jamal did not just conduct that forensic audit for my personal entertainment. Apex Defense Tech operates on multi-million-dollar government logistics contracts. We require absolute, flawless financial integrity from every single vendor and partner we engage with. And right now, your boutique finance firm is aggressively bidding to become our primary wealth management partner." The video screen flickered to life, illuminating the dark office with a bright, crisp blue light. The feed connected directly to a luxurious executive boardroom in downtown Washington. Sitting around a polished granite table were 5 highly influential senior partners from Richard's finance firm. At the head of the table sat Gregory Thorne, the ruthless managing director, and Richard's direct superior. Gregory had spent the last 6 months aggressively courting my procurement team, practically begging for the opportunity to manage the immense wealth generated by Apex Defense Tech. Gregory smiled brightly into the camera, his charismatic corporate facade firmly in place. "Good morning, Madam CEO." Gregory greeted me, his tone dripping with practiced deference. "The entire executive board is thrilled you scheduled this impromptu meeting. We are incredibly eager to finalize our partnership and demonstrate the elite financial stewardship our firm can provide to Apex Defense Tech." "Good morning, Gregory," I replied smoothly, stepping into the center of the camera frame. "I appreciate you and your board assembling on such short notice. However, we have a catastrophic compliance issue that must be addressed immediately before my company signs a single contract with your firm." Gregory frowned, his confident smile instantly vanishing. The other executives leaned forward, their expressions shifting to pure, unadulterated concern. "Compliance issue," Gregory repeated, his tone dropping into a serious defensive register. "I assure you, our firm maintains the highest possible ethical standards in the industry. We have a spotless record." I stepped aside slightly, revealing the brightly lit background of my office. The camera perfectly captured Richard trembling in the corner, looking like a disheveled cornered rat. Brittany stood rigidly near the door, and Jamal stood beside my desk holding the thick audit binder. Gregory narrowed his eyes, squinting at the screen. Recognition hit him like a physical strike. "Richard!" Gregory barked, his voice sharp with sudden aggressive confusion. "What in the world are you doing in the CEO's suite of our most vital prospective client? You are supposed to be on approved personal leave for your wedding." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was entirely paralyzed. He managed a pathetic choking sound, his eyes wide with sheer terror. I turned my attention back to the screen, claiming absolute control of the narrative. "Richard is currently occupying my office because he recently finalized a fast-track divorce to end our marriage." I explained, delivering the words with surgical precision. "During that process, he attempted to secure assets he falsely believed were his own. Unfortunately for your firm, his profound financial illiteracy has directly exposed your company to a massive ethical liability." I gestured to Jamal, who stepped perfectly into the camera frame. "This is Jamal, a certified public accountant and lead auditor from an independent oversight firm," I introduced. "He has just completed a comprehensive forensic audit on Richard's recent financial activities. I have just transmitted a secure digital copy of this audit directly to your boardroom tablets." Inside the video feed, the executives immediately looked down at their glowing devices. Gregory tapped his screen, pulling up the executive summary. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. I watched Gregory's face transition from confusion to shock, and finally to a volcanic, barely contained rage. "As you can see from the verified data," I continued, my voice relentless and steady, "your senior manager has been actively funneling corporate resources to finance an extramarital affair. He utilized a restricted corporate credit card funded by Apex Defense Tech to purchase luxury hotel suites and imported jewelry for his mistress. Furthermore, he blindly signed legal liability waivers during our divorce, attempting to seize a commercial property without conducting a single basic financial review. As a result, Richard is currently bound to a $1.2 million commercial debt owed directly to my company, which he has absolutely no means of paying." I placed my hands flat on my mahogany desk, leaning slightly toward the camera to deliver the final crushing ultimatum. "Gregory, my defense firm handles sensitive high-clearance government contracts. We cannot and will not sign a multi-million-dollar wealth management agreement with a firm that employs someone so remarkably compromised. Richard has demonstrated a complete lack of basic financial literacy, severe ethical corruption, and massive legal recklessness. Engaging with your firm while he represents your brand is a security risk I refuse to take." Gregory Thorne stared at the camera, his chest heaving with explosive anger. He did not attempt to defend his employee. In the ruthless world of high finance, a mid-level manager was entirely disposable, especially when a multi-million-dollar contract was on the line. Gregory turned his burning gaze directly onto Richard, who was now visibly shaking, tears of absolute panic streaming down his flushed face. "Richard!" Gregory growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying contained fury. You used a prospective client's corporate funds to finance a personal affair. You committed financial fraud while representing this firm. You have jeopardized the most lucrative partnership this company has seen in a decade because of your pathetic, arrogant stupidity. Gregory, please, Richard begged, taking a desperate step toward the video screen, his hands clasped together in a pathetic plea. I did not know she owned the company. I thought it was just a regular credit card. I can fix this. I will work overtime. I will pay her back. Please do not let this ruin my career. I just got married. You do not have a career to ruin anymore, Gregory fired back, delivering the fatal blow without a single ounce of mercy. You are officially terminated effective immediately, because this termination is the direct result of documented ethical violations and corporate fraud. Your entire severance package is completely voided. You will not receive a single cent from this firm. Furthermore, our legal department will be reviewing this audit. If your reckless behavior brings any legal liability to our door, we will sue you for reputational damage and actively seek the revocation of your financial licenses. Richard gasped, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot. The last remaining pillar of his fake inflated existence had just been violently kicked out from under him. Gregory turned his attention back to me, instantly smoothing his expression back into a mask of professional courtesy. Madam CEO, I deeply apologize for the catastrophic lack of judgment displayed by our now former employee. I assure you, his actions do not reflect the integrity of our board. We have removed the liability. We hope this swift action demonstrates our absolute commitment to securing a clean, ethical partnership with Apex Defense Tech. Your swift action is noted, Gregory, I replied smoothly. My procurement team will be in touch on Monday to resume our contract discussions. Have a productive weekend. I reached over and tapped the control panel. The video screen instantly went black, severing the connection and plunging the room back into silence. The automatic blinds whirred quietly, rising to let the bright, blinding sunlight flood back into the penthouse office. The illumination revealed the absolute total ruin of the man standing before me. Richard stared blankly at the empty screen, his mouth hanging open in silent, devastating shock. He had lost his luxury home. He had lost his premium vehicle. He was buried under a $1.2 million corporate debt. His sister's marriage was destroyed because of his lies. And now his prestigious career and his steady income had been completely vaporized in less than 5 minutes. The crushing reality of his situation finally broke through his suffocating delusion. The arrogant, boastful man who had marched into my hospital room and demanded my complete submission was entirely gone. Richard's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the plush carpet of my office, falling heavily to the floor. He crawled forward, his hands grasping desperately at the edge of my mahogany desk. Tears poured down his face, soaking into his wrinkled dress shirt. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, broken agony. "Diana, please," Richard sobbed, his voice a broken, guttural whine. "I have absolutely nothing left. I am completely ruined. I am begging you, give me a second chance." I looked down at him, entirely unmoved by his desperate tears. The financial execution was complete. The man who had mocked my military service and tried to strip me of my dignity was now crawling on my floor, begging for mercy. I had dismantled his fake empire piece by piece, simply by letting the natural consequences of his monumental arrogance run their inevitable course. He had wanted a fast-track divorce to start his new wealthy life, and I had granted him precisely that. He received the very reality he so recklessly demanded. Now he would have to spend the rest of his miserable life trapped beneath the immense crushing weight of his absolute unforgiving destruction. The heavy double doors swung open almost instantly. 2 broad-shouldered security contractors stepped into the executive suite, their dark suits and severe expressions leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. They approached Richard, who was still clutching the edge of my desk, gasping for air, as the catastrophic reality of his situation crushed the last remaining fragments of his sanity. He looked up at the guards, his eyes wide and bloodshot, but he lacked the physical strength to resist. One guard grabbed him by the upper arm, hauling him to his feet with effortless authority. The second guard gestured firmly toward Vanessa and Brittany, wordlessly commanding them to move. "Diana, wait, please," Richard choked out, dragging his feet as the security guard hauled him backward toward the exit. I can fix this. Just give me 1 day to figure this out. You cannot just throw me out like this. I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort. I simply turned my chair slightly toward the panoramic windows, entirely dismissing his existence. The heavy doors closed behind them with a definitive, satisfying thud, severing his access to my world forever. But I was not quite finished watching his destruction. I tapped the control panel on my desk, bringing up the high-definition security feeds from the executive hallway, the elevator, and the main lobby. I leaned back, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, and watched the brutal implosion of the family that had spent 4 years treating me like dirt. On the crisp, high-resolution screen, I watched the guards march the 3 of them down the sunlit corridor. Richard stumbled repeatedly, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained with his own panicked sweat. Vanessa walked a few paces behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach as she hyperventilated. Brittany trailed at the very back, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The security guards escorted them into the glass-walled elevator and stepped back, swiping a keycard to send the car straight down to the ground floor without any stops. The camera inside the elevator captured the suffocating, toxic tension perfectly. For the first 30 floors of the descent, absolute silence dominated the small space. The adrenaline of the confrontation was rapidly wearing off, leaving behind the chilling, undeniable truth. Richard stared blankly at the floor indicator, his mouth hanging slightly open. He was a man who had just lost his lucrative job, his luxurious house, his premium car, and his entire professional reputation in the span of 30 minutes. He was currently bound to a $1.2 million commercial debt, with zero income and zero severance. As the elevator passed the 20th floor, Brittany finally snapped. The realization that she had legally tied herself to a man drowning in insurmountable corporate debt completely shattered her gold-digger illusions. She turned to Richard, her eyes blazing with a feral, vicious intensity. "You are broke," Brittany said, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "You are completely, utterly broke. You dragged me into a hospital room to mock a woman who makes almost $1 million a year, while you do not even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee. You lied to me about the house. You lied to me about the car. You are a pathetic, worthless fraud." Richard flinched, shrinking away from her aggressive posture. "Brittany, babe, listen to me," he stammered, his hands shaking violently as he tried to reach for her. "I have contacts in the financial industry. I will call a few recruiters on Monday. I will land another executive role. We can stay at a hotel for a few weeks until I sort out the invoice with Diana. I will bounce back from this, I promise you." "Bounce back!" Brittany shrieked, slapping his hands away with absolute disgust. "Your own boss just fired you on a video call and threatened to revoke your financial licenses. You stole corporate funds to pay for my jewelry. You committed massive financial fraud. No firm in this country will ever hire you again. You are toxic waste, Richard." She reached down and violently grabbed her left hand. With a harsh, aggressive yank, she pulled the diamond wedding band off her finger. The ring, which Richard had purchased using a line of credit he could no longer pay, glinted under the harsh elevator lights. "We have been married for exactly 3 days," Brittany snarled, stepping directly into his personal space. "I am calling an annulment lawyer the absolute second I walk out of this building. I am telling the courts that you committed financial fraud and lied about your assets to secure the marriage. I am washing my hands of you and your entire pathetic family. Have a nice life living in a cardboard box, you absolute loser." She threw the heavy diamond ring directly at his chest. The jewelry bounced off his wrinkled shirt and clattered onto the elevator floor, rolling into the corner. Richard stared at the discarded ring, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. His brand-new wife had just completely abandoned him before the ink on their marriage certificate was even dry. But the nightmare was far from over. The elevator chimed, coming to a smooth stop at the ground floor lobby. The glass doors slid open, revealing the towering marble atrium and the imposing security desk. The 2 guards waiting in the lobby immediately stepped forward, ready to escort the disgraced trio out of the corporate fortress. They walked out of the elevator, but before they could even reach the biometric security gates, Vanessa suddenly erupted. The reality of her own catastrophic situation had fully registered. Her brilliant, successful husband Jamal was currently filing for a legal separation. Her marriage was completely destroyed, and the $50,000 she had stolen from her joint savings account was gone forever. Vanessa grabbed Richard by the shoulder and violently spun him around in the middle of the lobby. "I need my money back right now," Vanessa screamed, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of country club elegance. Her shrill voice echoed across the marble floors, drawing the attention of several high-level corporate employees passing through the atrium. "You heard what Jamal said. He is going to leave me. He is going to freeze all our accounts. You told me it was a temporary banking error. You swore on your life that you would pay me back on Monday. I want my $50,000. Richard recoiled, holding his hands up defensively, as his sister advanced on him like a predator. "Vanessa, please keep your voice down," he begged, his eyes darting toward the security guards who were now moving closer. "You were in the office. You heard what my boss said. They stripped my severance package. They fired me. I do not have a single dollar to my name. I cannot pay you back right now." "You will find a way," Vanessa shrieked, shoving him hard in the chest with both hands. Richard stumbled backward, nearly losing his balance on the polished floor. "Take out a payday loan. Sell your watch. Beg your friends for cash. I do not care what you have to do. You ruined my marriage to fund your fake, pathetic lifestyle. You made me steal from my own husband. You are going to fix this, or I swear I will sue you myself." "I have nothing," Richard screamed back, finally cracking under the immense, crushing pressure. Tears of pure frustration and despair streamed down his face as he screamed at his own sister in the middle of my lobby. "The luxury car is gone. The house is gone. My job is gone. My new wife just threw her ring at me and walked out. I owe Diana $1.2 million. I cannot give you $50,000 because I am completely, utterly bankrupt." The raw, pathetic admission hung in the air, a devastating confirmation of his absolute ruin. Vanessa stared at him, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. The brother she had blindly worshipped, the man she had constantly elevated above me, was nothing but a hollow, broken shell. She let out a guttural sound of disgust and turned away from him, her shoulders shaking with heavy, defeated sobs. "Escort them out." I heard the head of security command over the lobby surveillance feed. The guards immediately stepped in, grabbing Richard by the arms and firmly directing Vanessa toward the revolving glass doors. Brittany was already storming ahead, pushing her way out onto the busy downtown sidewalk, desperate to distance herself from the catastrophic mess she had willingly married into. The guards pushed Richard and Vanessa through the doors, forcing them out into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the city street. The sky above had darkened, heavy gray clouds gathering as a cold, biting drizzle began to fall over the pavement. The security personnel stepped back inside, firmly locking the heavy glass doors and leaving the fractured family standing on the wet curb. Vanessa furiously dug into her designer purse, pulling out her car keys. She stormed toward the designated visitor parking lane, where she had hastily abandoned her sedan earlier that morning. Richard scrambled after her, desperate for a ride back to the suburbs so he could figure out where he was going to sleep that night. He reached out to grab the passenger side door handle, but Vanessa aggressively shoved him away. "Do not touch my car!" Vanessa hissed, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. "You are not getting in this vehicle. You are not coming home with me. You destroyed my marriage, and I never want to see your pathetic face again. You can walk back to your $1 million debt." She unlocked her car, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. She started the engine and aggressively pulled away from the curb, leaving her arrogant brother standing alone in the pouring rain. Richard stood on the wet sidewalk, shivering in his wrinkled dress shirt, his hair plastered to his forehead by the freezing drizzle. He looked wildly around the busy corporate district, surrounded by towering skyscrapers and successful professionals, hurrying to their warm, lucrative offices. He had no car to drive. He had no house to return to. He had no wife waiting for him, and he had absolutely no money to even call a cab. I sat back in my plush leather chair watching the pathetic scene unfold on my high-definition monitor. I reached over, picked up my hot cup of artisanal coffee, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. The financial execution was flawlessly complete. The trash had successfully taken itself out, leaving me perfectly undisturbed in my quiet, impenetrable fortress. I tapped the control panel, turning off the lobby feed, and returned my full attention to the multi-million-dollar defense contracts waiting on my mahogany desk. The future belonged entirely to me. Exactly 1 week after that pathetic display on the rain-slicked pavement, the final and inescapable stage of Richard's total destruction was officially set into motion. The setting for this concluding chapter was a high-end legal conference room located on the top floor of the most prestigious corporate law firm in the city. The space was designed to intimidate. It featured a massive polished granite table, stark leather seating, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the bustling metropolis below. The air inside the room was meticulously climate-controlled, crisp, and entirely devoid of any emotional warmth. It was the perfect environment for a brutal clinical financial execution. I sat perfectly still at the head of the long granite table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute impenetrable authority. My attorney, Bradley, sat to my immediate right. Bradley was a ruthlessly efficient corporate lawyer who viewed emotional family drama as nothing more than a series of contractual vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. He had spent the last 7 days preparing an ironclad legal trap that would permanently seal my ex-husband's fate. We did not speak. We simply waited in the suffocating silence for the target to arrive. The heavy frosted glass door swung open, and Richard was escorted into the conference room by a paralegal. The physical transformation he had undergone in just a single week was staggering. The arrogant, boastful financial manager who had strutted into my hospital room was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, hollow shell of a man. Richard wore a cheap, unpressed suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His face was pale, his eyes were heavily bloodshot, and a rough shadow of stubble covered his jawline. He had spent the last 7 days bouncing between cheap motels after Brittany threw her wedding ring at his chest and abandoned him on the curb. He had no job, no car, no home, and absolutely no leverage left in the world. Richard pulled out a leather chair opposite us and collapsed into it, his hands shaking slightly as he rested them on the cool granite surface. He looked up at me, his expression a pathetic mixture of profound exhaustion and lingering, desperate hope. He still believed there was a sliver of mercy left to be extracted. He honestly thought this mediation was an opportunity to negotiate, to apologize, and to somehow magically erase the catastrophic debt he had blindly signed up for. "Diana, please," Richard began, his voice cracking with a pathetic, grating whine. "I have lost absolutely everything. My firm fired me. My professional licenses are under review by the ethics board. Brittany filed for an annulment on Tuesday. I am living out of a suitcase in a motel that charges by the hour. I know I made a massive mistake, but you have to stop this. You have to forgive the corporate debt. You have your house back. You have your company. Just let me walk away." I did not offer him a single word of comfort or acknowledgement. I simply turned my head slightly, gesturing for my attorney to take complete control of the room. Bradley adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and opened a thick leather binder, pulling out a stack of crisp legal documents. He did not look at Richard with pity. He looked at him like a math equation that had already been solved. "We are not here to negotiate your feelings, Richard." Bradley stated, his voice a flat, freezing monotone. "We are here to finalize the legal liabilities you willingly and aggressively assumed during your expedited divorce proceedings. You insisted on a fast-track divorce. You explicitly demanded sole possession of a commercial property owned by Apex Defense Tech. You willingly signed a comprehensive liability waiver releasing my client from any financial burden associated with your choices." Bradley slid the first document across the granite table. "This is the final legally binding eviction notice," Bradley explained, tapping the paper with his expensive pen. "Because you defaulted on the $20,000 monthly commercial rent, your tenancy at the Oakbrook property is permanently terminated." Corporate security has already cleared the remaining items you left behind. If you step foot onto that property again, you will be immediately arrested for criminal trespassing. Richard stared blindly at the eviction notice, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. "I cannot pay $20,000 a month," he gasped, his eyes darting frantically toward me. "I do not have a job. You know I cannot pay that." "Your inability to pay does not negate your legal obligation," Bradley countered smoothly, sliding a second much thicker document across the table. "This is the formal acknowledgement of your commercial debt. As outlined in the invoice delivered to you last week, you are legally bound to pay the $1.2 million commercial buyout price for the asset you attempted to seize. Because you have failed to secure financing, this debt is now in default." Bradley slid a third document forward, and this one carried the absolute crushing weight of permanent financial ruin. "Furthermore, my firm has already filed a preemptive garnishment order," Bradley continued relentlessly. "Any future wages you earn, whether at a fast food restaurant or a retail store, will be heavily garnished to satisfy this corporate debt. Your bank accounts will be monitored. Any assets you attempt to acquire will be immediately seized by Apex Defense Tech. You will spend the rest of your natural life working solely to pay back the company owned by the woman you tried to leave destitute." "This garnishment order," Bradley elaborated, his tone slicing through Richard's mounting panic, "ensures that your financial ruin is absolute and perpetual. The court order mandates that up to 70% of any disposable income you generate will be automatically diverted directly into Apex Defense Tech accounts. You will never secure a mortgage again. You will never qualify for an auto loan. You will never hold a premium credit card. Your credit score is effectively obliterated. The luxury lifestyle you stole from my client is permanently eradicated from your future. You will spend every waking moment of the rest of your natural life working minimum wage shifts just to pay down the interest on a massive corporate asset you never even owned." The sheer inescapable horror of his reality finally crashed down upon Richard. He realized he was not just broke, he was going to be financially suffocated for the rest of his life. His panic instantly morphed into a desperate cornered rage. The fragile veneer of his apology vanished, revealing the toxic, entitled man who had mocked me in the hospital. "I will not sign that," Richard shouted, slamming his fist against the table. "You cannot do this to me. I will hire a lawyer. I will take you to court. I will tell the judge that I was manipulated. I will say Diana hid her wealth and tricked me into signing those divorce papers. I signed them under extreme duress. The judge will throw the entire contract out when I explain that I was a victim of massive corporate fraud." Richard gripped the edges of the granite table so tightly, his knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. His chest heaved as he frantically searched the room for an escape route that simply did not exist. The crushing reality of a lifetime trapped in grinding poverty was utterly paralyzing. He looked at the polished glass walls, staring at his own pathetic, disheveled reflection. He could not accept that his grand, arrogant plan had collapsed into this spectacular disaster. The sheer magnitude of his failure fueled a sudden, desperate surge of blind denial. I remained perfectly still, watching his pathetic outburst with clinical detachment. Bradley did not even blink. He simply reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small digital audio recorder. He placed it carefully on the granite table and pressed the play button. The pristine acoustics of the conference room amplified the recording perfectly. It was the security audio from my hospital recovery room, captured legally by the hospital internal patient protection monitoring system. Richard's own arrogant, booming voice filled the silent room, echoing off the glass walls. "Because I am done carrying dead weight, Diana," Richard's recorded voice sneered with absolute malice. "I am keeping the Tudor-style home in the suburbs, and I am keeping the luxury SUV. You can take your little $3,000 a month army paycheck and figure out your own life. You will never recover financially from this, but that is no longer my problem." The recording continued, capturing every single cruel, calculated word he had spoken. It captured him bragging about his lawyer expediting the paperwork. It captured him demanding I leave the house so he could move his pregnant mistress in. It captured him mocking my military service and boasting about his superior financial status. It was the undeniable, crystal-clear sound of a man eagerly and aggressively orchestrating his own absolute triumph. Bradley pressed the stop button. The silence that followed was suffocating. "There is no duress, Richard," Bradley stated, sliding a pen across the table. "There is no manipulation. We have undeniable court-admissible proof that you aggressively initiated the fast-track divorce, demanded the assets, and mocked my client while she was recovering from emergency surgery. You orchestrated the entire legal maneuver entirely on your own. If you attempt to challenge these documents in court, I will play this recording for the judge. I will also submit the forensic audit detailing how you used corporate funds to finance your extramarital affair. You will not just lose the civil case. You will face immediate criminal charges for systemic financial fraud." Richard stared at the black pen resting on the polished granite. His breathing was rapid, shallow, and ragged. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to life in a lightless prison. He looked at me one final time, searching my face for even a single microscopic trace of pity. He found absolutely nothing. I looked back at him with the cold, unyielding authority of a woman who had built an empire while he played house with stolen money. "Sign the documents, Richard," I commanded, my voice slicing through the room with chilling finality. "Acknowledge the debt, surrender the property rights, and accept the garnishment order. If you delay this process for even one more minute, I will instruct Bradley to file the criminal fraud charges before you even reach the lobby elevator." Richard's shoulders collapsed completely. The fight completely drained out of his hollow, broken body. He reached out with a trembling, sweaty hand and picked up the heavy black pen. A single tear rolled down his unshaven cheek and splashed onto the pristine legal paper. He pressed the pen to the signature line. With slow, defeated strokes, Richard signed his name on the first document. He turned the page and signed the second. He turned to the final page and signed the binding acknowledgement of his insurmountable $1 million debt. He legally surrendered every single avenue of escape, permanently chaining himself to a lifetime of financial servitude. Bradley smoothly pulled the signed documents back across the table, inspecting the signatures with a satisfied professional nod. He closed the thick leather binder, sealing the ironclad trap shut forever. "We are done here," Bradley announced, standing up and adjusting his suit jacket. "A copy of the garnishment execution will be mailed to your current motel address. You are dismissed." Richard slowly stood up from the granite table. He looked completely hollowed out, a walking ghost of the arrogant manager who had once tried to destroy my entire world. He did not say another word. He turned and shuffled out of the high-end conference room, dragging his feet across the plush carpet, as he walked out the door to face his bleak, desolate future. I remained seated at the head of the table, my posture perfectly straight, my mind entirely clear. The legal execution was flawlessly completed, and my total victory was absolute. 3 months later, the brutal reality of that victory was playing out exactly as the court documents had mandated. The crisp autumn air had given way to a freezing, relentless winter, providing the perfect backdrop for my ex-husband's entirely self-inflicted misery. Richard now resided in a dreary, rain-soaked motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. His luxury suburban mansion had been traded for a single, dimly lit room that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap industrial cleaner. The man who had once mocked my military uniform and boasted about his $90,000 corporate salary was now wearing a polyester uniform of a completely different kind. He worked the night shift at a 24-hour fast food drive-thru. Every single time his modest paycheck was issued, the court-mandated garnishment automatically ripped away 70% of his disposable income, funneling it directly into the Apex Defense Tech corporate accounts to service his insurmountable $1 million debt. He was functionally trapped in a cycle of grinding, inescapable poverty. Desperation had entirely consumed him. During his bleak, solitary mornings in the motel, Richard constantly attempted to reach out to the people he had dragged down with him. He dialed Brittany's number relentlessly, hoping to spark some lingering ounce of sympathy from the woman he had thrown his marriage away for. But Brittany had blocked him on absolutely every conceivable platform before her annulment paperwork was even filed. She had vanished completely, washing her hands of the broke middle manager she had foolishly mistaken for a titan of industry. Left entirely isolated, Richard resorted to stalking his own sister's social media accounts from a cracked, outdated smartphone. The updates he saw only deepened his crushing despair. Vanessa was no longer attending country club luncheons or hosting lavish suburban dinner parties. She was currently living in a cramped, incredibly modest apartment across town, quietly finalizing the last stages of her bitter divorce from Jamal. Her toxic loyalty to her arrogant brother had cost her the only decent, successful man who had ever cared for her. She had absolutely no money left to offer Richard, and she had made it violently clear that she never wanted to see his face again. The sheer, suffocating isolation finally broke the last remaining fragments of Richard's pride. In a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation, he boarded a public transit bus and rode for 2 hours through the freezing rain toward the elite corporate district. He had no plan, no leverage, and no dignity left. He stepped off the bus and trudged through the freezing downpour, making his way toward the towering glass fortress of Apex Defense Tech. He stood on the wet pavement, his cheap uniform soaked through to the skin, shivering uncontrollably as he stared through the massive reinforced glass doors of my headquarters. He was hoping to catch me. He was hoping to fall on his knees in the lobby and beg for financial mercy. But as he stood there, completely pathetic and broken, the heavy glass doors automatically slid open. I walked out of the towering skyscraper, flanked by 2 towering executive security contractors and a team of senior defense analysts. I wore a flawless tailored winter coat over a custom designer suit, actively discussing the final logistical parameters of a massive upcoming deployment. My presence commanded the absolute attention of everyone around me. Richard lunged forward, stepping into the freezing downpour. "Diana," he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, desperate agony, struggling to be heard over the pounding rain and the bustling city traffic. "Please, just look at me. I have nothing left. Please help me." I did not break my stride. I did not alter my conversation, nor did I allow a single muscle in my face to register his pathetic existence. I looked right through him, treating him with the absolute freezing indifference one might reserve for a stray piece of trash on the sidewalk. I stepped smoothly into the warm, plush interior of my waiting chauffeured car. As the vehicle's heavy door closed, my security detail swiftly stepped forward, forming an impenetrable human wall that physically blocked Richard from stepping a single foot onto the corporate property. Through the tinted bulletproof glass of my departing vehicle, I watched him collapse onto his knees in the freezing rain, entirely defeated by the crushing weight of his own monumental arrogance. The profound contrast between his bleak reality and my thriving empire had never been sharper. 2 nights later, the brilliant crystal chandeliers of the National Veterans Charity Gala illuminated the most exclusive ballroom in Washington. The room was packed with highly decorated military officials, prominent politicians, and the most elite defense contractors in the nation. I stood at the master podium looking out over the sea of powerful attendees. I was not there as a guest. I was delivering the keynote address, having just finalized a massive, unprecedented logistics contract with the Department of Defense. The new federal partnership officially cemented Apex Defense Tech as a dominant, untouchable force in the global security sector. I spoke passionately about resilience, leveraging my military background and immense corporate wealth to announce a new mentorship initiative explicitly designed to fund and support young female veterans transitioning into the business sector. The applause that followed my address was thunderous, a resounding validation of the empire I had built entirely on my own merit. As I stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with 4-star generals and industry leaders, my eyes caught a familiar face across the crowded ballroom. Jamal stood near the private networking lounge, looking incredibly sharp in a tailored tuxedo. He was attending the gala as the founder and lead executive of his own highly successful, independent certified public accounting firm. Having completely and cleanly detached himself from Vanessa's toxic, enabling family dynamic, Jamal's professional career had skyrocketed. He had protected his assets, secured his peace of mind, and built his own thriving enterprise. Our eyes met across the luxurious ballroom. He raised his glass of champagne slightly, offering a subtle, deeply respectful nod of professional triumph. I returned the gesture with a warm, genuine smile. We were two professionals who had recognized the fatal liability of toxic people and had the absolute courage to cut them loose before they could drag us down. It was a silent acknowledgement of our shared victory over the manipulation and deceit that had once threatened to consume our respective lives. Later that evening, the gala concluded, and my chauffeured car brought me back to my private multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline. I stepped out onto the expansive wraparound balcony, the crisp night air, entirely refreshing against my skin. I held a crystal glass of expensive vintage wine, gazing out at the vast, illuminated metropolis that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The silence of my sanctuary was profound and deeply satisfying. I took a slow, measured sip of the rich wine, allowing myself a moment of absolute, undisturbed reflection. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this exact pinnacle of success. I had not needed to raise my voice, throw a single punch, or act out of desperate spite to achieve this victory. I had simply stepped back, established an ironclad boundary, and allowed the trash to take itself out. I had given an arrogant, entitled man the exact rope he demanded, and I watched with clinical detachment as he enthusiastically tied his own financial noose. My victory was not born from revenge, but from an unwavering commitment to my own self-respect. I pulled my secure corporate smartphone from my coat pocket to check my morning schedule. A tiny red notification blinked in the corner of the screen. I opened my filtered spam folder. Sitting there, quarantined from my actual life, was one last, pathetic voicemail from a blocked number. The transcript preview revealed a rambling, tearful plea from Richard begging for a second chance, begging for financial relief, begging for the woman he had so cruelly discarded. A calm, deeply satisfied smile touched the corners of my mouth. I did not listen to the audio. I did not read past the first frantic sentence. I simply pressed my thumb against the screen, hitting the button marked delete permanently. The message vanished instantly, erased from my digital ecosystem just as thoroughly as Richard had been erased from my existence. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, turning my full attention to the glittering city skyline and the absolute limitless brilliance of my future. I took another sip of wine, perfectly content in the knowledge that my empire was entirely secure, and my true independence was finally permanently achieved. The cool, refreshing breeze washed over me, carrying the absolute certainty that I would never be underestimated or manipulated ever again. My extraordinary life was completely, undeniably my own now and forevermore.